Welcome in, I'm Artress, and in this video we're going to be going over every leader in the game and ranking them as far as how strong they are in the OP10 meta. At the time of this recording, we're about 3 weeks away from OP10, and to be quite honest, it feels like it's taken forever to get here. I don't know why. I think it's usually this amount of time in between sets, but it just feels like we've been in this set for quite a while. So OP10, in my opinion, can't come fast enough. So quickly, let's go over how we do our tier list here. We have S through F, S being the meta-defining decks. These are decks that I feel like could probably be in the top 8 very consistently. A tier decks or event topping decks I feel like could be in the top 16 to top 32, probably maybe even crack the top 8 from time to time. And then in the B we have the competitive decks, which I feel like are probably good top 64 decks, and maybe could be a little bit better than that depending on the pilot or depending on the luck. And then C plus we have a new addition, which is Rogue. These decks are not quite that bad. They can definitely be played in a competitive setting. However, I don't know how good they're going to be in a 9 to 10 round tournament, and so with the correct pilot, maybe with enough time, I feel like they have a chance to crack the top 64, the top 32. Beyond that, not quite sure, but these decks usually don't see too much play, and I feel like have probably potential to do well. Then we have the C tier, which these are good decks overall, but these are probably not very viable in a competitive setting. I could be wrong here, but I feel like these are better to be left at locals and probably do very well there with. And then finally, the F tier are freelo decks. These are decks that if you go against, you're probably going to win more times than not. I feel like this tier specifically makes a lot of people upset, so apologies if your leader ends up here. Please keep in mind that whatever I do rank leaders at, don't take it personally. It's just my opinion. My opinion might differ than yours, and if so, that's fine. Let me know what you think in the comments below, but just do so in a respectful manner. That's all I ask. With that being said, strap in because this might be a long video as far as going over every leader. If you haven't subbed already, please make sure to do so before we start, and make sure to give the video a thumbs up. It helps out the channel so much. Thank you all for the support. Also, make sure to join the Discord if you'd like to talk about the One Piece card game outside of the YouTube comments. The link for that is in the description below. So instead of going into these tier lists with a blank slate, I do like to have what I predicted would be strong in the previous set as far as a basis into going into the next set, because not a lot does change in between different sets for these leaders. There are some things that get support, some decks get hyper buff, some decks don't get too much, but there aren't too many drastic changes, so this is a good starting spot, at least what you see on the screen. We'll go through these and talk about where I feel like they lie within the OP10 meta, and then at the very end we'll place the 6 new leaders that we get from OP10 into this tier list and talk about how they fall into the meta overall. Starting off, I actually think that what I predicted the meta would be like was pretty accurate, at least for the most part. Sometimes I'm off, sometimes I get close. This one I feel like wasn't too awful. I felt like Black Yellow Luffy was going to have a little bit more representation as far as topping decks. We did see it win some events here and there and obviously be a very consistent top 8 deck. However, I feel like Doflamingo probably was the better deck overall. We've seen more tops with it, more consistency, and I think that was to be expected. I just didn't want to put Doflamingo as like #1 overall. I feel like Black Yellow Luffy could have been a good like devil's advocate deck to the Doffy reign, but going into 10, to be quite honest, it doesn't get too much to make it that much better. It is a good deck as is, and it's pretty complete, I would argue. There are some things that you can tech in here and there. It only really gets like one good piece of support with the 2K counter beige in yellow that basically allows you to take your top life and put a supernova at the top of it, so you do have supernovas in your deck that you can play that with, and it might replace like Makino overall if you want to do that, but the core of the deck relatively stays the same. And I think when we talk about OP10, it's going to be pretty clear that there are like basically 2 decks in my opinion that are the best decks in the format, and that's Blackbeard and Doffy. I'll go ahead and get that out of the way. And because Blackbeard is a deck that gets more support in this next set, plus also is Black Yellow Luffy's, one of Black Yellow Luffy's worst nightmare decks to go against, I feel like Black Yellow Luffy will fall off a little bit as far as play goes. There will always be those players that will continue to play him and do well with him, so I feel like he's probably at an A tier, maybe not necessarily an S tier anymore in my opinion, but still very strong regardless. Purple Luffy is a deck that I feel is very similar to Black Yellow Luffy, where it doesn't really get that much more support in this next set. I think with the purple support that we are looking at in OP10, a lot of that is more of a Donquixote Pirates type support, boosting other archetypes rather than like Straw Hat Luffy. So I feel like Purple Luffy, despite it doing pretty well overall in the OP9 meta, it doesn't really get too many changes, and as a result, I think it still is a strong deck, very similar to Black Yellow Luffy, but I don't think it's quite quite S meta defining. I don't think we'll see it as often in the top 8. I can see it probably being a top 16 deck doing really well. And so I'm going to put it at the A tier, probably just slightly below BY. I think both of them are very strong decks regardless. These will be pretty solid choices to play in my opinion. Of course, I mentioned Doflamingo being one of the best decks in the format. I think we'll continue to see it be very excellent overall. It's one of those decks that I think a lot of people feel is very easy to pilot, and yes, it is. You can swing 7 and use your leader blindly and likely get something off of the top. You can stack your deck very easily. There's a lot of support pieces for it. I think that the ceiling with this deck is incredibly high, and I feel like at the peak of how it's supposed to be played with like players that are very inept at playing it, you will see this deck do very well in very strong pilots' hands. You might see it flounder a bit in an average player's hands. So because of that, I feel like Doflamingo will still be a very strong deck and likely the best deck in the format. I'll leave it here, and I think Blackbeard is a close second for OP10, and the reason for that is because he does get a couple of cards of support with the 5-cost Kuzan, which is absolutely insane of what it does, not being able to be removed at all, and then you can trash it to draw a card and then bring out a 5-cost Blackbeard Pirates character onto the field. That is just great value. You can't ask for more than that, but not only does it get that, it gets an interesting card in Shiryu, which I don't know if every deck is going to be playing it, where it is a nice little attacker early, but more importantly, you do get an event card called Liberation, which will help you fight Doflamingo a little bit easier because it KOs 2 cards on the field that are 6 and 4 costs. So if Doflamingo goes wide, which Doflamingo does, then Blackbeard has an event card on 6 that can answer that. So overall, Blackbeard, the consistency with the deck is going to be at an all-time high. You'll be able to find your pieces more often than not, and I think because of the new Kuzan and the Liberation, I think those cards put Blackbeard at an S tier deck overall. Probably, arguably, almost even the best deck in the format, just because Doflamingo is, still a threat to Blackbeard. I'm not so quick as to want to put Blackbeard at the #1 deck, but he might actually just be a #1 deck. All right, Shanks, a leader that I am very fond of. I played quite a lot of it in OP9 when I did play in any tournaments. He is a strong leader going into OP10. He gets a few pieces of support with the Chopper blocker, which is very interesting for your 3-cost spot. On defense, it has plus 2,000 power, and it's a 2k counter at worst. So that's really cool. You get a Divine Departure event, which is a 1-cost counter or main event, which is insane that you can have the flexibility there, being able to KO something with that on the main part of it, but also being able to use it defensively in the late game for only 1 Dawn, whereas the actual main part of it, I think, is 6 in total. So the fact you have some flexibility with that event, and you can actually lean more into the Red Hair Pirates archetype, you can add more consistency to your deck overall, putting Uta Searchers back in, maybe playing it more of a control style. I think Shanks is going to continue to be a strong deck to play into the next set, so I'm going to leave him in the A tier. I think that he's probably a little bit higher up than maybe Purple Luffy. I don't think Purple Luffy will see as much play because Purple Luffy doesn't get too many buffs, whereas Shanks gets a few buffs, and because of that, people might be willing to play it more often than not. BY, I don't know, that's a tough one because BY, I feel like, can beat Shanks on a consistent basis. Purple Luffy, I feel like, is a 55-45, but maybe it's favored more into Shanks going into the next set. It's a tough one to call. I think that it's pilot difference, maybe draw difference. That's kind of how you have to look at Shanks overall, but I feel like Shanks is still an A tier deck going into OP10. Lucci gets absolutely no support. Well, he might get some support, but at least nothing significant to the deck list overall into OP10. And I think that Lucci is a deck that you're going to want to play as a response to the meta, and so that is probably why I would put him towards the end of A tier. He's like one of these decks that's always really going to be good. He has such a strong package of being able to KO things, and honestly, like, if we see a lot of Doflamingo rise up, we could see Lucci really pop off. The fact is, I think Blackbeard really just negates this leader from being good. I think Black Yellow Luffy also gives this leader a lot of problems, and if these two are decks that are played consistently, then Lucci might not want to show his head very often. But if Doflamingo is overriding the meta, or Shanks is doing very well, or even Bonney, for instance, then Lucci will be one of these decks that I think will start to rise up a little bit more. I feel like Bonney players are going to be eating really well in OP10 because of a couple of cards that you get access to that make green very playable in my opinion. You have access to a new 5-cost 7,000 power Smoker, which has Banish, and then you can also activate main once per turn. Unrest one of your Dawn and leave it standing, which just plays into your leader ability, so the synergy there is very nice. Additionally, you get, and this is probably more important for all green decks in general, you get a very strong 2k counter in Tashigi, which will allow you to keep your units more protected overall from like KO or any kind of removal. As a matter of fact, I think it's any kind of removal to a green character, you can rest the Tashigi 2k counter and prevent that removal. So that overall is a huge buff to all green decks, and Bonney has already been one of these decks that's like on the fringe of being a really strong competitive deck, but it just doesn't quite have the oomph to be able to get there, or maybe doesn't have a way to protect its units as well against some of the worst matchups. But now with the Tashigi 2k counter, I feel like Bonney is just really ready to be one of these decks that I am seeing towards the top. I'm actually going to raise it up slightly higher than Purple Luffy. I feel like it's a really good deck. We might not see it perform that well overall, but I feel like it has a lot more potential to do well than what we've seen in the East. Red Purple Luffy is another one of the decks that does not really get too much support. It gets a little bit of the red support with the 2k counter Chopper that I talked about with Shanks. You can add this to the deck if you want, but that adds more of a defensive capability. There's nothing really that I think that this Red Purple Luffy will really take advantage of, to be quite honest. So I feel like it's still a strong deck. I'm going to put it in the B tier competitive. We did see it do well in OP9 because it does have a very strong package that it has access to in red. Red got a nice little buff in OP9, but I don't quite see it doing that well, or people playing it at a high extent, maybe as compared to what we're starting to see at the end of OP9. I think a lot of people will start to test out different decks, and as a result, Red Purple Luffy might not be one of those decks that people stick with. Enel is a very interesting leader in the fact that he just sticks around from set to set. He's just kind of there. If Doflamingo is going to be the best deck in the format, then we're going to see players play Enel, and I think that Enel doesn't get quite as much support as it will in EBO2, or at least impactful support. It does get a couple of pieces which it will use to its advantage, such as the X Drake 2k counter, which can rest a unit that is 4 cost or less. If you have equal to or less life, you have access to the 4 cost event Damned Punk, which can look at you or your opponent's top or bottom life, I think, and then like put it wherever you'd like. And it has a nice little trigger of draw 2, trash 1, so it is a good KO unit to get rid of something. It's like a balanced reject, if you will. But I think those two pieces might not necessarily put Enel in a tier that is going to be an event topping deck. I think it will be a deck that at the start of the meta will be potentially very good to play, because people are trying to figure out how to like get into the start of the meta. Same thing with Shanks. At the start of metas, usually these two decks are pretty consistently good. We'll see them, because they don't really change too often, we'll see them like consistently be towards the top of the meta. So I'm going to put Enel at the maybe top of B for now, and in EBO2, that will be a different story as he gets access to a new 10 cost boss monster that's just insane for his deck. So, but we'll get there when we do EBO2. Nami was a deck that I was completely wrong on. I felt that Nami was still going to be a deck that you could still top with, but we didn't really see this perform that much at all, to be quite honest. And so this was probably a very wrong call on my opinion. So I'll own up to that one, but I still think that Nami players will stick with her despite her probably not being very competitive overall. I think that she might be maybe at the bottom of B, top of C plus rogue. You can probably do well with her if you have a little bit of luck and get into some good matchups, but she does have a very rough time against both Blackbeard and Doflamingo, and as a result, if those decks are overriding the meta, then we're probably not going to see too much Nami, and in fact, she could probably not even be competitive at that point. I'm going to leave her at the bottom of B for now. I could be wrong, but I feel like she is at this spot based off of the decks above her. Smoker is a deck that also doesn't really get too much support. I think a lot of the black support in this next set is mostly aimed towards either Dressrosa or you have some Blackbeard Pirates support. As a result, Smoker doesn't really see too much change here. He's a strong deck regardless. I would say he's like slightly worse than Lucci at what Lucci's trying to do, right? They're both trying to like get rid of things on the board. Obviously, when I say that he's like slightly worse, they play differently. Whereas like Smoker's great at getting rid of tall bodies, Lucci's really good at getting rid of multiple bodies. Not saying Lucci's bad at getting rid of tall bodies, but I feel like Smoker's just slightly better at doing that. So I think that Lucci's still better than Smoker, and as a result, Smoker to me will be in the competitive tier around Enel, maybe a little bit better than Red Purple Luffy, but right around here is where I think he could be. All right, this was my cope pick for OP9, was the Red Purple Kid. I think that this deck has potential to do really well. Of course, it is one of those weird decks that has like a certain combo piece that you play in order for it to do well, and the consistency of it is obviously very questionable when you come to a long 9-10 round tournament. So yeah, I was definitely coping last set with this one being here. I think that it's a strong deck regardless, and I'm going to put it in the rogue tier because I think that maybe it could win something. I'm still coping. What am I talking about? It's definitely C+ rogue tier. It's a deck that has like a cool combo to it, has some strength to it. It didn't do nearly as good as I thought it would for 09, and as a result, I think it probably won't see as much play for OP10. Onto the competitive tier, we had Foxy in the B tier, and I think that Foxy gets a small piece of support in a 2K counter that allows him to draw a card, so he is able to build his board still relatively cheap and get it very wide so he can use his leader ability, but I don't know if that's necessarily going to be good enough for him to be a competitive deck. So I think that because he does have a great answer into the Doflamingo decks, he's still a strong pick for if there are a lot of Doflamingos being played in a tournament, but I will say that he's probably a C+ rogue tier deck. I don't quite expect him to be highly competitive or event topping, but he is a really good pick into some of the meta decks. So let's put him in the C+ rogue tier. Not saying he's a bad deck at all, but I don't think he's going to be played very often in OP10. Vegapunk, once again, a victim of not getting too much support in this set, and as a result, we're going to bump him down to C+ rogue tier. I think when EBO2 comes out, there is a new blocker that he gets access to that actually might help his kit a little bit more to be consistent as far as like building a wide board and being aggro, which I think is what Vegapunk is supposed to be doing. So until we do get that, I don't think he's going to be in a competitive tier quite yet again. So we'll put him in the C+ rogue tier for the time being. Red, Yellow, Belo, Betty is actually a pretty strong deck still. I think that we saw her pop off a little bit in OP9 where people didn't really expect her to do so well, but I think she's one of these decks that's obviously a glass cannon. You will either have to win by a certain time or lose by that time because your hand size is dwindling very fast every turn. You do get a couple of pieces of support in yellow. There are some Revolutionary Army card support pieces like the Ivankov, which actually buffs your board. And then you also have Inazuma, which is something that will rest a unit. So being able to rest a blocker with an attack. Overall, I think that Belo Betty's still a very strong deck. It's not necessarily going to be a consistently good deck in a long tournament, but I think it is still a competitive deck and has earned its spot in the B tier for OP10. Black Purple Luffy didn't get quite that much support as well. As you've noticed that there has been a trend with these top decks so far, not too much support for these decks, but I do think Black Purple Luffy does get to use the 6-cost Secret Luffy, which you can add in for your 6-cost or 7-cost spot. So I think that's a pretty important card in the deck for at least some people that want to build it a certain way. And as a result, I can see Black Purple Luffy still being a pretty strong deck, having access to ways to ramp up fast and then play some characters like Moria or Kaido or 10 drops. All of those options are really good, and Black Purple Luffy, I think, does it really well. And I want to see Black Purple Luffy do well in this next set. It's going to be an interesting one because it does struggle against Blackbeard. As a result, it's not going to be quite a good deck for a long tournament, but I do think that he's still a B tier deck at best. Katakuri is a deck that kind of fell off over the past set or two. There's not a lot of people that will play it very often, and when they do play it, we don't see it top as much as it used to. I think in its heyday, it was very oppressive, especially having 10 drops. But I think when you go against decks like Lucci that can handle the 10 drops pretty easily, or even decks like Blackbeard that will just completely shut off any kind of on-play effects, which guess what? Katakuri has a lot of on-play effects. Katakuri definitely struggles as a result, and I don't think this deck is going to be a competitive deck overall. I think it's a very strong deck. I actually think it's probably going to be at the top of C+ Rogue. It's a deck that people might take at the start of tournaments like an Enel and do well with it because maybe people aren't expecting to play against yellow or haven't played against like trigger decks in quite a while, and as a result, Katakuri might sneak up into some tops here and there, but I don't see it doing nearly as well. And the support that it does get, like, I don't know, it does get like maybe the 4-cost event that I talked about with Enel, Damned Punk. You can use that in this deck, but I don't quite know if it's worth running over like something like a Nami. So I am going to put it at the C+ Rogue tier for now. I think it's right around here. It's very strong. The power level of it is good, but I think that there's not going to be enough people piloting it, and the people that do, will they top with it? I'm sorry, but probably not. Marco's an interesting case where I don't think quite that many people are playing Marco anymore. I haven't seen too many Marcos in bigger tournaments, but with a new card in Monet next set, with a 2-cost that can rest itself and then give your leader +2 Dawn that have been rested, and then you can minus something by 1,000 power, that actually has a pretty good synergy with this leader. And as a result, you can build this more of a tempo, low to the ground, KO your opponent's board, and then have like these pesky little characters that are getting chip swings in. I think could be a reason to keep it in the competitive tier. I think there's a certain build that people have been playing that might do well. We'll talk about it later when we get to Marco in OP10 as far as video coverage, but I do see him being something of a threat, maybe potentially being like a top 64 deck, depending on, you know, the build and the pilot, of course. Perona might be a deck that could take advantage of this new Tashigi and Smoker combo. That might be something you can consider, at least with this leader. But I don't know if it wants to build too much into that package. I think it probably will just run the Tashigi, if anything, because that 2K counter is just insane at what it does. It doesn't change too much as far as deck composition, but there are some interesting builds that I've seen over time with Perona that have been decently competitive against decks like Doflamingo. I just think that a 4-life leader that's trying to control the board and make it to late game is a little bit rough in a meta where Doflamingo takes over quite easily. So I think Perona has potential to do well. I think Perona isn't going to be as quite at Leave at Locals level. I don't think it's going to be quite competitive either. So let's fall into the C+ tier. Where it falls right now, I'm not quite sure. To be quite honest, with like these Rogue and Leave at Locals tiers and even the F tier, there's not really an order to them per se. So we're just going to put Perona down here for the time being. It still has a strong package as far as getting rid of rested bodies pretty easily, playing the 9-cost Shanks, playing things like Jack and reducing. It has access to Gecko Moria, but because it has like nothing new for this set and we didn't really see it perform too well in 09, I don't imagine there's going to be too many people keen on trying to put in a lot of time and effort into playing this leader when it hasn't had too many results. We're going to leave Zoro here in a competitive tier. I think Zoro is going to be one of your best red decks to play for quite some time. Just the generic ability of being able to buff your entire board is always very strong. Going wide is going to be a nightmare against decks like Blackbeard, for instance. So Zoro could be a deck that we see rise up a little bit in popularity. And it does get access to the Chopper Blocker, the 2K counter, which can be searched out with the Animal package. So that's very nice. It can also be searched out with Nami if you're going more of a Straw Hat route. So yeah, I think Zoro, very strong. Not necessarily going to be a deck that's consistently great, but I do think that if people want to have a nice little aggro deck, Zoro is a pretty good option, and it could go toe-to-toe with Doflamingo. Obviously, Doflamingo is a better deck overall, and it has more value over the course of a game, but Zoro is a deck that could overwhelm Doflamingo if it does play it correctly. There have been a few Zoro builds that I've seen against Doflamingo that, not necessarily the build itself, just that the leader just started going very wide, swinging with choppers very quickly, could be a threat for Doflamingo if they don't see their bounce loss. So this deck has potential. I think it still belongs in the B tier. It hurts me to say this, but I think Reiju isn't quite as good as I thought it was in the B tier last set. I thought we might see it still do some damage here and there, but it didn't really do that hot. And so it doesn't do much as far as get new support for OP10. It does get a searcher, so it does add a little bit more consistency to the deck overall, which is very nice. This is a deck that I think we'll hold off on being too harsh on. We're not going to put it in the C tier quite yet. I think it does have some agency to be played in the next set because it does add more consistency. You can find your stage a little bit easier with the searcher that you get. But I think this is one that you're going to want to wait until OP11 to really invest time in, because when OP11 hits, there's more of the Vinsmoke family, the Germa 6/6 support that you get, which is very interesting to see. And maybe this leader could be pretty strong coming up in maybe another set or two, but not quite yet. So we're going to put it in the C+ tier. Rogue, I definitely think that this deck, with a good pilot and definitely a lot of luck, it's like one of these decks, if you don't open stage, you could be in trouble, but maybe with the searcher that will help with the consistency issues. Who knows? I think maybe we'll have to wait to see how this one does, but I don't think it's quite as good as I thought it was in the last set. Talking about Moria, Moria got a support piece with a Perona card that buffs Thriller Bark Pirates type by putting cards at the bottom of the deck. I don't know if that's really that strong or you'd rather want to add it to this deck, but I do think Moria has often been underexplored as a leader. I think that he has a strong package in the Thriller Bark Pirates, and black good stuff is just always nice to play. And you can use this leader to have good tempo plays, build a very wide board, and overwhelm your opponent by keeping their hand size very low. And so I think that general style of play will reward a good pilot. I think that we just see where a lot of people will fall into trends of playing what they consider to be the best deck in the format, and so we'll see quite a lot of people continue to play Doffy, quite a lot of people play Blackbeard. But Moria is a deck you might want to consider because it's actually not an awful deck overall. I think the fact that it has access to kind of just like change its game plan, and of course, ACOS Gecko Moria is kind of a dead card against Teach, but in other matchups, it's an amazing card. It's always going to be an amazing card. So the fact that this can get it back if it sees it in its trash is a very good thing for this leader, a nice little plus there. So I will continue to keep Gecko Moria leader in the B tier. Kaido's a deck that I feel like has just gotten all of the pieces that it would rather need for the deck for it to be somewhat viable, and we just haven't seen it perform. It's a deck that, despite it being a 5-life leader in purple, it just doesn't do as much or as well as like a purple Luffy would. It can't consistently ramp up without, you know, some kind of luck into getting the Onigashima Island on turn 1 or being able to search it out very early. And so, you know, I think because it does rely very heavily on that stage, and if you don't see it, it's the same case as it was with OP1. If you don't see the stage, you're going to have a troubled time into a lot of your matchups. You do have some more consistency pieces, but it doesn't really change much from the previous set. And I wanted people to play this one. I wanted to see this deck do a lot better than it did. I don't recall ever seeing it top. I feel like it's not necessarily going to even be a rogue deck per se. I think it's a deck you could probably just take to locals and it will do well at locals, depending on, like, obviously if you have a sweaty local, maybe not. But this is a deck that's overall not that strong in a competitive meta for OP10. I mentioned that green does get a nice little buff. Unfortunately, Uta is not a leader that really takes advantage of that buff because Uta really wants to play a lot of film package, and anything that's not film hurts the consistency of the deck. Uta's almost like 100% film package at this point. I think maybe some people play a couple of maybe 10 drops here and there. You could see some ACOS kids, but I don't think there's much room to run the Tashigi 2K. I feel like you could, but it would definitely hurt the consistency of the deck, and I don't see it quite doing well in a large tournament at all. This deck is a deck that you would probably bring to a off-meta night at a local and likely win with it because it's consistency, because it has access to the 9-cost Shanks, but otherwise, I don't see it doing that well in Treasure Cups or Regionals or whatever it may be. I think Boa is going to remain a competitive deck. Boa is a deck that has access to the Warlord package, but also gets new cards with the 7-cost Kairos, being able to bounce a 5-cost for only 7, and you get a 9,000 power body is extremely powerful there. It doesn't have a counter, of course, but that card just has great stat lines overall, and I think Boa is a deck that just can take advantage of that card overall. It does have a pretty good matchup into Blackbeard. It has a good matchup into BY, into Shanks, sometimes Bonney, depending on if you see a lot of your gravity blades. It struggles against Lucci, but Lucci's going to be a little bit more nerfed here. So I actually think Boa could be bumped up here in the competitive tier. I'm going to put Boa more towards the top of the competitive. I feel like she's a pretty strong deck, and she just gets like slightly stronger in the next set. So I'm going to put her at the top of the B tier. Red Yellow Sabo, similar to Red Yellow Belo Betty, only in color, not in the actual play style. Does though get some Revolutionary Army support, which you could run. There are different builds for Sabo. We do see more of an aggro variant do well more often, but I think that Sabo is going to be a deck that, even though it does get those 2 pieces of support, I think those support pieces are more aimed towards Betty, and as a result, I don't see Sabo topping quite often or at all really, but could, depending on maybe a meta shift. We do have bans. I don't know if the bans are going to come into effect for OP10 for us. If they do, who knows what they hit, and maybe Red Yellow Sabo could be better, but I think for now we'll put Red Yellow Sabo down in the rogue tier. I think it's a deck that I don't want to discredit its power because it does have some very powerful moves overall, but I don't see it doing quite well. Sorry. Red Purple Uta, I really like this deck. I don't think that's going to be a deck that people are going to want to play in a big tournament, especially against Doflamingo, where you only have 4 life. And once again, this is a deck that you want to be able to make it too late. You can obviously be able to bump your late game up faster because you can ramp up. but you're dumping cards to do that, and you need cards against Doflamingo, and you need life against Doflamingo, and considering that, I think Uta is not quite as competitive as I thought she was. I do think she's really good, don't get me wrong. I feel like I'm putting a lot of decks into rogue tier that were in the competitive tier last set, but I don't know. I think she is probably a leave it locals. I don't think she's a rogue deck necessarily. It's kind of understood how she plays, and how she plays is very good. Don't get me wrong. She's a very strong leader, but I just don't see her being a top 64 leader. Unfortunately, I don't see her doing that hot overall. The red and purple support for the set's not quite there, not quite for red, purple, Uta at least. So let's leave her at locals. I'm going to actually put her at the top of leave it locals, higher than Kaido. I think she's better than Kaido at this current game state. And once again, if your leader that you like is in a certain tier, it doesn't mean that it's awful. I just feel like it's probably not going to be a deck that you're going to see very often in the top tier tables. Red Sanji, a great counter to Blackbeard. I'll leave him in the competitive tier because he's just like red good stuff and beat face, go fast. And he has a potential to do really well against Blackbeard. And I think because he just like runs Blackbeard over is a reason to keep him in somewhat of competitive tier. You could bring him to a tournament and probably do well with the packages that you have. And he also just gets stronger in EBO2. But I think that he is probably towards the tail end of competitive. He's almost like a C+ rogue tier for me. He's not going to be played that often, but he is an excellent pick into some of the meta decks. On to Nico Robin, we actually saw her do pretty well in OP9, and I put her in the rogue tier. I thought that with the right build, she could probably do a long run at a tournament, and she did in a couple of ones. I think I saw her maybe top 32, maybe even better than that at the Latin America finals. I think that she placed pretty well there, but I don't quite recall where she was. I just remember seeing purple yellow Nico Robin there, and she doesn't get too much for this next set, but I think her banish is pretty strong. She's going to struggle against Doflamingo. She might struggle against Blackbeard. Probably not a might. She probably will struggle against Blackbeard, but she could be a good pick. Who knows? I think that, you know, yellow decks typically do well at beginnings of sets, and she does have access to Gum Gum Giant, which is a very strong card, and because of all that, we'll leave her in the rogue tier for now. Okay, so hear me out. I think Buggy is actually a competitive deck, and the reason why I think Buggy's a competitive deck is he finally gets access to the 7-cost promo, which that card absolutely just dunks on the Doflamingo deck altogether. And on top of that, he has a really good matchup against Blackbeard. And so those two matchups being the S tier decks that they are, I think that Buggy is probably a slightly more competitive deck. I'm going to put Buggy slightly higher than maybe what I should expect to see him at. I'm going to give him a little bit more credit here than I did last set. And I think Buggy could be competitive based off of just that one card, the 7-cost promo card that we've been asking for a while, and we finally get with the pre-release. So congrats, Buggy. You are playable again, or I guess for the first time. Papa Newgate, I don't think anything really changes much for this leader. And of course, when Pudding is a card that is being ran in the best deck in the format, this deck just folds instantly to that card. So I'm going to put Newgate at leave it locals, unless of course we see, you know, the boat get unbanned, which I doubt it will. I don't think it's going to be unbanned, if at all, but if it does, then it's not going to happen in OP10 at least. And so Newgate, we're just going to leave him at locals. We'll probably put him a little bit further down, maybe a little bit further down. Yeah, probably right around here is fine. And then we have Ace, which Ace is actually a decent deck, despite, you know, having a very similar core, I would imagine, to Newgate. You do run like the 5-cost Marcos, and I think that it builds more into a like KO package with Rayleigh as like opposed to a Newgate. So that coupled with like the Flame Emperor that you get access to for Ace only, I don't quite see him being super great, but I do think that he's not an awful deck, that you could probably take him to a tournament. There's always somebody at a tournament that ends up taking Ace, ends up going like 7-0, and it's insane because you're like, oh my gosh, there's somebody playing Ace doing well, and then they just start to fall off. So Ace is a leader that has potential. We're going to keep him in the rogue tier for now. Yamato is going to always be a threat, in my opinion, and she gets access to the Tashigi 2K counter, so we're going to leave her in the rogue tier. Nothing much changes with her deck. She's going to be very aggressive, try to close out the game very quickly with her leader ability and obviously playing Hody Jones, and all of that combined is still really strong. That package is very good. I just think that the fact that she is going to be going against 5-life leaders is always going to be a slight hindrance, and as a result, she's not going to be highly competitive because of that, but she is going to be a strong deck regardless and might end up taking a few people by surprise in tournaments. Blue, green, Zoro, and Sanji is going to be a deck that I cope with for probably until the day I die. I think it's a really decent deck overall. It's one of these that has a strong combo package. Being able to lethal people by surprise is always fun to do with this leader. We never really see it do well ever, and this is why I call it a cope deck for me, because it doesn't do well ever. But it's just, I feel like it's a good deck, and I feel like just nobody's playing it. Maybe I'm completely wrong here, and that's, you know, fine by me. I'll continue to be wrong and say that blue, green, Zoro, and Sanji is a rogue deck. Purple Yellow Croc doesn't do too much either. This seems to be the moral of the story for a lot of these leaders. There's not too much that it gets that makes it super exciting or rather worth playing over another leader. And so Purple Yellow Croc has, I think, its package already built in. I think that it's a strong deck, but I don't think it's going to be a deck you're going to want to pilot. I'm going to move it down to the leave it locals because, once again, it is a strong deck, but I don't think it's quite a rogue deck, and it won't take any tournaments by surprise. On to Black Blue Sakazuki. I thought that maybe people could mess around with this deck in this previous set, and you know, there's always time once people have the meta figured out and people try to like mess around and do things differently. Sakazuki is one of these that is not awful to mess around with. It still has access to the Navy package that it had before. It gets like more support over time. It has access to Kairos now if you want to run that, but this is a deck that I don't feel like I'm going to cope with as much as like a blue-green Zoro and Sanji. So this one is going to be a leave it locals, has potential to do well, but I don't think it's going to be quite a rogue deck, quite a deck you want to take to a tournament. So we're going to leave it in the C tier for now. A deck that I'm going to be super happy to talk about is Blue-Black Rebecca here. There's a lot of Dressrosa support that we get in OP10, and to be quite honest, I feel like she's probably not going to benefit as much as like an Usopp would. I think that she is going to be a strong deck at most. I don't know if she's going to be a competitive deck. I don't know if I've found the right build quite yet. With Doflamingo in the meta, it is still terrifying to bring Rebecca to a tournament because of the fact that Doflamingo just swarms the board and you just can't pressure as hard as you want, because you just can't swing. That's the big issue here. You can't swing, you can't pressure. You get access to the 4-cost Zoro, which is going to make your Doflamingo matchup a lot easier than it has been in the past. But is that enough to make this leader viable? Maybe. I'm going to put Rebecca at the top of rogue tier. I almost want to put her in a competitive tier, but I don't think she is quite ready for that yet. Will she be ever? I'm not quite sure if she'll ever be as strong as she was in OP04. That just felt like a really strong meta for Rebecca to be played in. However, if Doflamingo eventually does get banned, I feel like this leader is going to pop off. Doflamingo feels like it is holding Rebecca back based off of just how strong and aggressive it can be, and Rebecca needs time to build into things. Despite it getting a lot of support, I think, like I said, the support is mostly aimed towards the Usopp build, and so Rebecca for me is going to be a very strong deck. I'm going to try to cook with Rebecca for this next set, but I don't think I'd be too comfortable taking her to a big tournament quite yet. Maybe by the end of a set, if I've had a lot of practice on her and kind of figured out what I need to change as the meta evolves, yeah, then I could see Rebecca being brought to like a Treasure Cup or a regional. Red Green Law is in an unfortunate position where I feel like it just gets dunked on by a blue Doflamingo. I feel like Teach just stops a lot of its on play effects. Even if you do go wide, it doesn't really matter as much because like what is good about Law is you have on play effects, which will allow you to recycle things with obviously like the blocker Law. And you having that turned off by Blackbeard, or all of your board getting destroyed by Shanks, or all of your board getting bounced by Doflamingo, and then having an aggressor at your face, just makes Red Green Law in a really tough spot for this next set. In fact, it was in a rough spot for this set too. Even if you do go like more of an aggressive build like the animal package, is that going to be good enough to make Red Green Law awesome? Probably not. So I'm going to move Red Green Law down to the C tier. I think that over time we might see this bump back up because of the fact that it is such a combo-centric deck, and if decks like Lucci aren't necessarily around as much, or like, I don't know, anything that controls the board heavily, then Law might start being good again, but I don't quite see him being a competitive deck, unfortunately. Vivi, I think, is still going to be a rogue deck. I really like the fact that she gets even more access to like removal. So Kairos is a perfect fit for this deck. I think Kairos is going to be a spot where you can flex it into different things. Also, you get access into the Cavendish, the 4-cost Cavendish from Dressrosa. Being able to give that rush and then immediately draw 2 trash 1 is a strong interaction with Vivi. And so Vivi, I think, is still going to be a rogue deck. I'm going to put it at the bottom of rogue deck. I don't think it's going to be a quite competitive deck, but it is a deck that I feel like if you want to take it to a local, you're going to do really well with it. If you take it to a big tournament, you might not, but you might. You never know. And so as a result, I think she's a rogue deck for that reason. Red Green Oden gets some interesting support. I don't know if it necessarily takes advantage of it as much as some other Wano leaders, and I didn't mention this with Yamato, and I don't think it quite falls into Yamato's build, but you do get access to this Wano Kinemon package where you're able to like trash characters on your side of the field and cheat out Kinemon for cheap. That more so is going to be an effect that we see take advantage of in the actual Kinemon leader and also the Oden leader for Mono Green. I don't think it quite is a red-green Oden, but you might, and it actually could be an interesting build to go with for red-green Oden. And if people want to mess around with it, I don't blame them. I'm going to leave him in the rogue tier. We're putting him at the bottom, slightly below Vivi, and when we'll get to these other leaders, we might move this around as well. But we'll keep him in the rogue tier because I'm interested to see how this Kinemon Wano package is. There are some people that do well with red-green Oden as is, with some interesting builds, and so who knows, maybe people could expand on that with the Kinemon Wano package that we get in this new set. Green-purple Doflamingo actually benefits a lot from this set, getting both support in green and also purple. More so in the purple aspect of things because it does get a new searcher with a sugar searcher. It does get access to an 8-cost, 9,000 power body that cheats out a Donquixote Pirate's 5-cost. And then you have the 5-cost Rosinante, which will allow you to draw cards or get like an event back or even leave Dawn rested or standing rather at the end of your turn. And so all of those things make this leader a lot more viable, and I think that it could be a good deck. I don't think it's going to be a competitive deck per se. I don't think that any of the Donquixote Pirates support that it gets is going to make it an excellent deck, but it's a really strong deck regardless. And so I'm going to bump it more towards the top of row tier because of the support. It actually might be better than Rebecca because of the fact that it does have a way to cheat out another body and then go wide easier than Rebecca does. I think the Doflamingo is actually pretty decent. We'll leave him at the top of row tier for now. I'm also bumping up Rosinante, so we're bumping these two up towards the top of rogue tier. I think that this deck gets slightly more annoying with the Tashigi 2K counter in this next set. Being able to protect a green unit from removal on a deck that already has ways to protect from removal is really annoying. And Rosinante is just going to get even better with EBO2, so we'll leave him at the rogue tier for now. Dragon's a deck that I don't really see it doing too well in this next set. I think that it had potential to be a rogue deck based off of like how just strong red got last set. But it doesn't really have anything new. Unfortunately, I didn't mention this for Sanji. Sanji gets access to a Sanji character that you can give Rush to, and then on KO, it draws a card. It buffs itself on your turn. So red decks do get that card as well, but I don't think Dragon really takes advantage of that. And so Dragon will unfortunately fall to the C tier as a result. I'm going to put him right around here, kind of just leaving him in the same spot as he was within the rogue tier, slightly below Red-Green Law. Red-Black Sabo, a deck that doesn't really get too much either, but it does get access to the 6-cost SEC Luffy. So on top of the leader ability, you have to KO that Luffy twice in a turn, which is going to be very difficult for a lot of people to do. But unfortunately, this leader just doesn't do very well overall. I think if we see a lot more like Lucci or decks that can KO things, then yeah, we'll see Red Yellow Sabo pop up here and there. But unfortunately, it's a leave it locals for me. Iceberg is one of these that I didn't think it was good when it first came out, and it wasn't really good when it first came out. There was people that swore by it, but I think that it's a deck that just nobody plays anymore. Like, it's a deck that could be very interesting. The fact that in EBO1 got a lot of support and we just didn't see anybody play it. It goes very wide, very fast, and it has a lot of recursion. If you have a lot of units that the opponent gets rid of, you're able to get them back relatively easy with other cards and then play those cards out again. And so it's a deck that I feel could do well. I just don't know why it's not. It's just a deck, obviously it doesn't attack. That could be a problem. But the fact it goes very wide is so strong. But yeah, alas, because it hasn't done well in the past couple of sets overall, I'm going to leave it in the rogue tier. I don't want to like discredit it too much, but I don't think it's that strong of a leader to be able to bring to a big tournament. It's maybe a deck that I'll cope by a little bit, practice with here and there, have some fun with, but yeah, probably not one you'll want to bring to a big tournament. Hannibal is a leader that we just, I'm going to be honest, it's not going to be a leader I'd ever want to play personally, and as a result, I might be a little bit biased here. It is a leader that I don't feel is quite good. The purple support in OP10, doesn't apply to it. Blue support doesn't really apply to it much. I think what it's trying to do is play a lot of your mid-range like Jailer Beast, and then once you get to the top end area of like 10 cost, you can start playing really big bodies relatively fast, but it's a 4-life leader and the deck doesn't have too much synergy in what it's trying to do. I'm going to leave it at locals. Unfortunately, we're moving it down from the rogue tier here, so let's put it right around here. River of Law is a deck that I don't know why it's in the rogue tier. I don't know what I was thinking last set when I did this video, but I think that it's not necessarily a leader you're going to want to play anytime soon. The ability is just quite a neutered version of the previous one, and it doesn't have that much support or playability overall, in my opinion. So we're going to move it down to the F tier, right above where you know, his predecessor here. I don't think it's quite that bad, but maybe I'm over exaggerating. I don't know. It's not necessarily a deck I'd really ever want to play with. All right, let's look to see who's next on this list. We have Lim. Lim is actually going to be bumped up quite a lot. This is my most improved deck for OP10. She gets quite a lot of interesting tools added to her arsenal. She's able to have a nice 2K that can stun a Dawn. She has a Mihawk that can reset, I think an Odyssey character based off of like rested characters. And I think Lim is in a really good spot in OP10. I actually think she is an A tier deck. I don't know if she's quite better than like a Lucci or a Purple Luffy. She might be right around here, to be quite honest, but I feel that she is pretty solid. And so we're going to bump her up all the way to the A tier. Oh yeah, she also gets this like 1-cost character that can restand your Odyssey character, at least one Odyssey character at the end of your turn. And so what ends up happening is you have your ability where all your characters come in rested, and then there's characters that restand themselves at the end of the turn, plus also the 1-cost that restands a character and protects itself is really interesting. So I think that Lim is definitely going to be a strong deck to play in OP10. Black Luffy doesn't really change. It's not really that awful. It has a strong core overall, and I think it just stays where it's at. No new support. It's definitely a deck that had its heyday at some point at the end of like, I think the 8.5 meta. But yeah, I don't quite see it doing as well anymore, and we'll leave it where it's at for now. Yellow Big Mom, I'm going to move it up to the rogue tier. I was talking about Katakuri earlier, and I thought Katakuri wasn't nearly as strong, but now that I'm thinking about it, with access to Hawkins, the 4-cost Hawkins that will trash a life on KO and has a trigger, you also have the 8-cost trash a life kid on play and then draw a card, trash a card if your opponent's at 2 or less. I think that both of these decks will take advantage of that, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. I think Big Mom, the yellow Big Mom, will take advantage of it a little bit more. But I think that it makes it a rogue tier deck because of that. I think that because it takes advantage of that a little bit more than maybe this Katakuri would, I feel like it's actually not too bad. And so I'm going to continue to say that Katakuri is a rogue deck and that Big Mom is shortly not too far behind it. Voting, unfortunately, will have to watch Big Mom and Katakuri be above her in this regard because nothing really changes for this deck. It does obviously play 10-drop Big Mom, and that's always strong. But when Doflamingo is your best deck in the format and you hate aggro decks, as Pudding, you're going to have an awful time, and I think you're going to get run over very quickly, very easily, and Pudding will be a deck that, unfortunately, will have to remain in the C tier. Calgara is in the EBO2 waiting room for the 10-cost Enel, so will remain in the C tier for now. Queen could be an interesting rogue deck for OP10 because of the Hawkins, because of the 8-cost Kid. You get access to the 7-cost Kairos to bounce something back on 7. So actually, rogue might be where it belongs. It could be, because it gets all these tools, might be more impressive than I originally think. So we're going to put it around the middle of the rogue tier, I think. That's probably a fair spot for it to be. Yeah, those support cards, especially the 8-cost Kid, being able to trash a life and then have your leader ability be online is pretty strong. Also, the draw one, trash one, filtering out your hand. Queen needs that. Yeah, I actually think Queen's a strong rogue deck. If you're looking to play a black-purple deck, I would actually just recommend black-purple Luffy instead because you do have the giant access. Black-purple King, unfortunately, it's a good deck. It's not an unfortunate thing. It's a good deck, but it's unfortunately not a deck that is going to do very well against the top-tier decks in the meta. I think that it has something that it just is missing. It's like maybe an extra life. If this was a leader that was a 5-life leader at black and purple, it would be insanely broken because King just needs like a little time, and if King can get some setup, it's really hard to come back from. But unfortunately, it's just not going to be able to get that setup in a meta where a lot of decks are spitting out bodies relatively fast. So I think King will remain at the leave it locals tier. And I think that also falls into line with the Zephyr. I think Z is a deck that is obviously built differently than Black Purple King, but it's trying to kind of do some of the same stuff. It's supposed to ramp up and then play really big bodies like Kuzan, and along the way maybe use your leader ability with Black Maria to do well, but it's a deck that I just don't feel is overall a strong deck to take to a tournament. And as a result, we're going to keep it at the C tier, and we're going to look at these next couple pretty quickly because I also think that like nothing really changes for this King. I think he can probably stay at the C tier, leave it locals. As a result, Blue Purple Kaido is probably in the same result, maybe a little bit higher because of the fact that he does get like Kairos. I think Kairos is a good tool for a lot of blue decks because the 7 curve is kind of like awkward for some blue decks. You play Gravity Blade, and I think that's pretty much it. But now you have access to a character that bounces and has a really strong stat line. So maybe Kaido would still be a leave it locals. We'll give him a little bit more credit than where he is at right now. So we'll bump him here, but that doesn't really mean too much in the grand scheme of things, to be quite honest. Looking at Magellan, I don't really feel like this leader is that strong. I don't even know if it's a leave it locals. I think it differs from King in the fact that it builds more of the jailer beasts, whereas King builds Animal Kingdom. So looking at just like mono purple decks, I feel like obviously there's two very different decks, but they kind of fall in line at the same point of like, are they that good? Would you want to take them to a big tournament? Are they even worth playing at a locals? Maybe you could play with them and do okay, but even then, I wouldn't really recommend it. So that's why they're towards the tail end at the C tier here. Blue Purple Croc, I actually am going to move up to the top of the leave it locals. I think that this is a really cool deck. It has a lot of interesting synergy, and I think with OP9 giving it some more support in the Baroque works makes it stronger, but not necessarily a rogue deck overall. Chopper's in the EBO2 waiting room, but is not an awful deck in the meantime. It's still a C tier deck, but not nearly as low as I thought it would be. It does get some nice support, like I mentioned, in EBO2. So once that happens, it might even be a rogue deck at that point. I'm going to move Carrot up to the C tier. I think because she's a 5-life green leader, you might just want to play Bonney instead of her. Obviously, her ability being able to rest 5 cost when they have Minks on the field is very nice. But, you know, I think Bonney's a better green leader, but you also can use Tashigi in this deck as well. And as a result, she's a pretty strong leader. Let's put her around, I would say, maybe this tier. I think all of these leaders right here are like on the edge of being really good decks. And so I feel like Carrot is one of those decks that might be on the edge of being a really strong leader, but something's slightly missing. There's a better green deck out there, but green overall gets a nice buff in this set, so I'm happy to put her in the C+ rogue tier. Blue Yellow Ace might get the yellow 2K Sabo. I'm not quite sure, but regardless, I think it's still a deck that it's just a really inconsistent deck, unfortunately. The more I play it, the more I wish that it had like better pieces to like recur your like Luffys and your aces, like the baby Luffy, baby aces. If you don't see baby Luffy, baby ace on a consistent basis, it's a really like uphill battle with this deck. You can squeak out wins if you get kind of lucky, and when it does high roll, it is really good. But unfortunately, the high roll doesn't happen too often, and as a result, it's just a C tier deck. There's nothing I'm super excited about with Ivankov. I think Ivankov is well known as far as what it does. I don't think it gets really much support that it uses in OP10, and I think it's probably fair to leave it at the locals spot. I might even put it at the F tier, to be quite honest. I don't think I'd even want to bring it to a locals. It's not an awful deck, but like, it's not a great deck either. I wouldn't really feel confident playing this or even really want to mess around with it. So unfortunately, I think I'm going to move it down to the F tier. Is it an awful deck? No, not really, but it's a deck I don't even think anybody would want to bring to a local, to be honest. And I really liked that leader when it came out. I played it a lot. I wanted it to do well. I invested in the deck, and it was a deck that just fell flat very fast. So unfortunately, even with the EBO1 support that I got with Inazuma, I don't think that it makes it quite good enough to be a strong competitor. Kid can probably stay in the C tier. It's a green deck. We can probably bump it up because it gets access to Tashigi. It gets access to Smoker, so you can run those if you'd like. But I don't really think anybody's going to be running Kid overall. It could be an interesting leader to mess around with, play more of an aggro variant of green with like Kid, as opposed to Bonney being more of a defensive green deck. But I think it's probably just a deck you're not going to really want to play with. Red Green Luffy is going to be probably a higher tier than it is right now, or not higher tier, but at least bumped up within the C tier. I don't think this is a rogue deck per se, but of course with the 3-cost Sanji that you get, being able to restand that and swinging twice with a pretty low costed unit and then on KO draw a card, pretty good value overall. Is that good enough to make it a strong deck? No, but I think it's probably a deck that warrants a little bit higher than what it was, at least in OP9. Arlong is also like Chopper in the EBO2 waiting room, where I think there is some nice little Fishman Pirates that you can get that I think overall would be good to the deck, but it's not going to be great in the meantime. You get Hawkins, and Hawkins is an amazing card for this deck, but I don't think Arlong is really a deck to be taken seriously right now. So we'll leave him in the C tier. He's not quite enough. He's definitely a leader that I would like to mess around with and like, that sounded weird, but create like a really cool deck list. Maybe do like a 50 trigger Arlong and see how that goes. But that's not a deck I would really want to take to a big tournament. Hody Jones, just good green stuff. So we're going to keep Hody in the C tier, probably bump him up. I don't really think it really matters, but we'll put him here. I think just the fact that he can protect his units a lot easier now is a huge buff to this leader. That was the problem, is that you would put a unit down and then it would be removed pretty quickly. Of course, being able to protect it now, very strong. I actually think Kinemon is going to be a rogue deck. I think it has a very interesting combo that I mentioned earlier, where you're able to cheat out a 6-cost Kinemon, and then the Kinemon cheats out, I believe, a 3-cost Wano, and so you can build up a slightly wide board really fast and make it threatening for your opponent. And so I feel like this Kinemon is going to be a rogue tier deck. I would probably put it higher up here. I could see it doing well. I could also see it not doing well, but I think this is a really interesting new build, maybe some a breath of fresh air into this leader, and we'll give it new life. And so I'm going to leave it in the rogue tier for this set. Red Black Garp is a leader that I didn't really give much credit for in the past set, but in OP9 I did see it making a few waves here and there, and I think that it could be a leader that maybe I undervalued. And so as a result, I'm going to bump it up to the rogue tier because I did see it do fairly well with a few people. I don't know if it was at a local level or if it was at a higher level, but there was some people talking about it. It was making waves, and so I'm going to move it to the rogue tier and show it the respect it probably deserves as a result. Black Yellow Linlin. I feel like I'm probably going to get flamed for this one, but I think it's F tier. There was a build that was going around that was very interesting, and I really liked this build that I saw. It was kind of like a hand hate build where you have to make your opponent discard a bunch of cards over the course of a game, but unfortunately it was just never a good deck. Regardless, even if you do get some nice yellow support overall, I just don't think that it's going to be a great leader. Regardless, it's going to be a fun leader. So maybe the F tier could be for fun, because I think that I would enjoy playing this leader, especially with like the 8-cost Kid trashing a life and your opponent's like discarding the entire time. That could be fun for me, not your opponent, but I think that overall she is not very good. This Luffy is also not very good. You could run the animal package, as I think some people have been doing. I think I saw Real_Josh was running a animal package on like one of his streams, and I think that was a really interesting build and definitely made this leader a lot more fun. And so once again, F is for fun. We're gonna move Luffy down to the F tier. I don't think he's a leader that I would ever really want to take anymore to a tournament. I think his heyday of OP2 being very strong is quite gone, unfortunately. Sad as it is to say, I'm also moving the Yamato to the F tier. There's not much that really invigorates me to want to play this leader. I think that if you're playing a yellow leader, all of the other yellow leaders I mentioned before are definitely more appealing overall because of the fact that they have access to 10-cost Big Mom. This Yamato does not, and the fact that it is a vanilla leader until you are at 2 life doesn't feel very good to play, unfortunately. Maybe over time this leader will bump back up and be a better leader. I think that in the meantime though, unfortunately, we're going to have to sideline her and put her in the F tier. So with that, we're actually into the F tier for the leaders that I mentioned in OP9. So this is actually going to be a huge change here. We're moving Oden from the F tier all the way to the rogue tier. I think Oden takes full advantage of that Wano Kinemon package and can do like some interesting combos. And I think there might even be an OTK with this Oden. It's very interesting. I'll mess around with it and see what I can come up with, or at least like take some inspiration from other builds that I've seen as well. Definitely one of the leaders I'm looking out for in OP10 as far as a very fun but also could be very threatening leader based off of that combo. Let's cruise through some of these here. I think that the Black Lucci doesn't really change much, so we'll keep it here. Kairos, unfortunately, just is a weird leader, yellow-black, that wants to like KO things by flipping life. I guess you could take advantage of the 7 cost, and there might be a build you can build with the 7 cost. When I say 7 cost, I'm talking about the secret law that can put I think a supernova into your life. If you want to build it that way, maybe there's a way you can build that. There could be some testing to do with this leader. Unfortunately, I don't think it's super good, but I think it might be missing something. So we'll put it in the C tier at the bottom of it because I want to mess with this leader a little bit and see if there's anything I can come up with. Purple Shanks, sadly, it just was dead on arrival, and it's always been that way. Green Black Isho has never really had a strong showing, despite it having access to Navy and like Gecko Moria. I think that Perona is going to be your best bet at Green Black, and even then, Perona is sometimes questionable. But even worse is this Isho. So I think that even though it does get some support, it actually gets like an Odyssey piece that you can put into your deck. Still belongs in the tier that it's at. I think this Kuro, it feels like its time might be coming, but I don't think it's quite there yet. I don't know if there's anything in EBO2. I can't remember, but I feel like this leader is in general underexplored, always really relatively bad, but maybe its time is coming. I feel like there's something in EBO2, but I can't quite remember. But regardless, because there's nothing quite yet in this set for this leader specifically, and Tashigi sure could be used in this leader, might make it slightly better, but honestly, I feel like it's probably just going to remain in the F tier if that's the case. This Black Luffy is very uninspiring to play. I'd rather just play this other Black Luffy that's somewhere up here that I talked about earlier. I don't see it. Here it is. In the C tier, just play this one if you're wanting to play Black Luffy, but even then, probably don't play this one. So we're going to leave this one in the F tier. Nothing really changes for it, and it's always relatively just been awful. Blue Croc actually might move up to the C tier here because it does get access to the Kairos. Being able to bounce things has always been Croc's strength, and so having another tool to be able to do that with makes it strong. So I think it will be a okay leader to mess around with and see how it does. Blue Luffy also might be an interesting leader where with the Cavendish being able to draw 2 trash 1, filter your hand, and then be able to like counter out with the stuff that you drew into could be decent. I don't think that it really has much else that really inspires me to play it. I'm going to leave it in the F tier. Unfortunately, like its other blue counterpart I just talked about with Croc, it doesn't really take advantage of the 7 cost Kairos, so we're going to leave it in the F tier. Red Uta is probably a pretty easy one to skip over. Nothing really has ever changed with this leader, and the fact that it has a leader ability that is directly tied to like vanillas doesn't really do much for me. And it's just like one vanilla that it can do something with. So yeah, I'm going to leave Uta here. Blue-green Sanji. This is an awkward one because I've been talking about how good green has gotten over the set, but does blue-green Sanji really do much with it? I don't think so. And it doesn't really do much. It's like trying to do another vanilla package thing where you're playing characters without effects and getting Dawn back. So that's kind of cool, but yeah, I feel like vanillas are not necessarily where you want to be at when you're playing on a competitive level. So we're going to leave it in the F tier. The black Sakazuki has always been bad. It's always just going to be bad. I don't think it'll ever be good. It will always remain F tier for me, at least. And then we talked about this red purple law, and of course at the very end we have to show our respects to the leaders that have been long deceased with us, the red purple law, and then of course the black blue Sakazuki, which leads us to our new leaders from OP10. And these are very exciting here. We're going to go in color order the best that we can. So starting off with red green Smoker. This leader is a leader that has a couple of effects here. One, if you have a character that has power of 7,000 or more on your side of the field, you can restand 2 Dawn on your side of the field. Very nice to be able to get that additional value for your Dawn after being able to play something. So I really like this leader's ability here. The other part of the ability is that it buffs your Navy and Punk Hazard characters by 1,000 power on your turn. So that will make it a little bit more easy to defend as far as that goes. It is a strong leader. I really do like this leader. I think that we've obviously seen it do well in the East, I think it's the EBO2 meta. It has a couple of very annoying combos. It has the ability on 5 to play out the Smoker that has Banish and can restand a Dawn, and then you restand the Dawn with the Smoker, you restand 2 with your leader, and then you play out the Tashigi, and so then you have these 2 bodies on the field, and the Smoker is protected by the Tashigi, making it
very threatening for your opponent because now they're going to have to face a banish attack the following turn. It also has the ability to play the 8-cost Kid on 8 and then also rest it and protect itself, or at least put the Dawn underneath it to have the focused attack go into it the following turn. So that's really strong. So I think that this leader is actually a strong competitive leader. I feel like it's better than probably some of these. I feel like it's probably better than Marco. It might be better than Black Purple. And I feel like it probably is around this leader. It's like the middle of the B tier. I feel like it's a strong deck. It's definitely proven its worth in the East as far as EBO2 goes. In OP09, or sorry, rather OP10, I don't know if in the East it's done well, but I can see it doing well because of just the ability that it has. Looking at Red Blue Caesar, this is a leader that it says Dawn ×2. You may return one of your Punk Hazard cost 2 or higher characters to your hand, and then you can KO a character that has 4,000 power on your opponent's side of the field. This leader plays very odd. It's like red and blue has always kind of like had a very clashing color combination where blue is trying to bottom deck, but red is trying to do things with like power. And so Caesar is trying to do things with power, like reducing the power of characters and then bouncing things back to your hand. So I guess it's kind of like a blue aspect bouncing. But honestly, like I don't really see this leader doing very well. I think it can probably annoy some decks in the fact that it's constantly just getting rid of one body a turn and can probably overwhelm those decks. But if you have a deck that goes wide, Caesar just folds to it because it can only really answer one body a turn. The Monet was definitely made for this deck for sure. But other than that, I don't really feel amazing playing this deck. I think that it has kind of a weird issue of just like not really establishing a board. You're getting rid of your opponent's board every turn. You're kind of swinging big, but like you're not establishing a board of your own. Doesn't feel great. So I'm going to put the Caesar Clown Red Blue leader in the C tier. I might put him like right around here. I'll be generous. I'll put him at the top, towards the top of C tier. Could cook with him, maybe do well, but I don't know. It kind of feels like an awkward leader overall. Then we have this Red Purple Sugar. I feel like this leader is interesting. It has, once again, a couple of abilities here. So the Sugar is able to, at the end of your turn, if you have a Donquixote Pirates with 6,000 power or more, it restands, I believe, one of your Dawn. And then also, whenever you activate an event, you add one Dawn from your Dawn deck and set it as active. So those two abilities are very powerful in the fact that you're able to have a lot of Dawn standing at the end of your turn. In the early to the mid stage, you're trying to search out events or search out like your combo pieces like the 8-cost Doflamingo into the 5-cost Rosinante. And then late game, you can drop things like Shanks and then restand your Dawn with the Rosinante and have the ability to play defensively with like not necessarily Red Hawk, but you do get like a really nice red event that minuses by 2,000 but pluses by 3,000 on your side. So overall, really strong in that regard, but I don't think that it's going to be a deck we're going to see a lot of at top tier tables. It could be doing well against some of the decks that we'll see in the meta, but I'm going to leave it in the rogue tier, or at least put it in the rogue tier to begin with and see how it does from there. I think it's probably about the middle of the pack, to be quite honest. I think the ability to play defensive is pretty good, but does that make it an amazing deck? Not necessarily. On to Green Yellow Law. I think that Green Yellow Law is going to be a really strong deck, even though people have said that it's probably not a great deck overall. The ability to cheat out bodies, 5-cost bodies, is really good. The ability here is that if you have a combined cost of 5 or more on your board, then you can reveal the top card of your life, and it's if a supernova that's 5 cost or less, then you can play that card out by bouncing a card back to your hand. So it's kind of a combo deck where you're supposed to build up your board. It's very easy, obviously, once you get to like the 5 Dawn turn to be able to hit this stipulation. You bounce cards back to hand, so you're getting like searchers back to hand or getting like cards that you would like 2Ks or whatever it may be, back to your hand, and then you can play out something from your life. It's a very finicky deck in the fact that it is kind of glass cannon where you're playing things from the top of your life, but you have cards like the 7-cost Law, which will heal you up. And you're supposed to be playing this deck as like a combo aggro deck, spitting out a lot of 5-cost bodies like the Bonnies. You have like Cavendish, you have the Restand Law, you have the Blocker Law. There's a lot of different things that it can play. You can even play the 8-cost Kid if you so choose. I think this leader is going to be a good leader in the right hands, but I don't think a lot of people will do well with it. I think it's actually the definition of a rogue deck, where if you have somebody that puts a lot of time and effort into it and takes it to a tournament, has good matchups, and ends up, grinding the hell out of this deck, then I think it could do really well. We're going to put it in the rogue tier. I think it's not necessarily going to be a strong deck by the end of the meta. Who knows? Maybe people will actually put some time into it, but we're going to put it in the rogue tier towards like maybe right around here towards the top. I think if somebody, you know, puts a lot of time into it like they did with Red Green Law, obviously different decks, but kind of like the combo-esque centric style of play, this could do well. Blue Black Usopp, my fellow copers, we unite. I actually think this leader is really strong. I'm going to put it in the A tier event topping. I think it's better than probably these decks. I think it's slightly better than Lim. I think it actually can do well against Lucci. It has problems against like Shanks. Blackbeard can be an interesting matchup, but it is really heavily favored into the Doflamingo matchups. I think it's really strong against BY. I think Bonney, if you're building it with more like a Venor Lumbus build, it can be a good advantage for you to play against. I really like Usopp. It's a deck that I'm going to be grinding for this next set and hopefully doing well with. It's a deck that I feel like when I play Rebecca, because like Rebecca is like the deck for me, really. I feel like this is how I wanted to play Rebecca. Having more of a tempo-based playstyle, overwhelming the opponent's board, and just getting really good value is overall how I would hope to play Rebecca, and Usopp does exactly that. Being able to, I didn't even talk about the leader ability because I'm just like so excited for this leader. It has a couple of abilities here. It says your Dressrosa type characters that are cost 2 or higher get +1 cost. And the other thing here is if you have 5 cards in your hand or less and one of your Dressrosa type characters gets removed from the field, you can draw a card. So against removal decks, at least you don't get hard punished by having your things removed. You at least get to draw a card off of it. And there is a combo on 7 for Usopp where you play a 7 cost Rebecca, which is new from OP10. It brings out a 7 cost and a 4 cost. The 7 cost is standing, the 4 cost is rested. So then you bring out a Kairos on 7 with the 7 cost, and then you bring out whatever 4 cost you like. Maybe a Zoro, the character that KOs a card on play. You are able to bounce a 5 cost and then KO a 4 cost, and then swing with the Kairos if you have stage. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, I'll show you in a video, in a future video. It's an insanely valuable combo, and I think that actually makes that deck really worth playing overall. So I'm going to put Usopp in the A tier. It's not quite the best deck in A tier. I'd say it's probably towards the bottom of A tier, but I can see this deck doing very well. And then we have Yellow Kid. This is a leader that says at the end of your turn, you may flip one of your life cards face up. And if you have a supernova that is cost 3 to 8 on the field, you can restand it and then give it blocker. So it is a very different style of play than we've seen in other yellow decks. It plays a little bit more defensive, plays for the late game, being able to stay alive with your blockers, swing with them and then restand them, have a lot of nice on-play effects. With the 8 cost Kid, the 7 cost Law that will heal yourself. You have a lot of little options to sustain over the course of the game. You have a lot of blockers, good value cards, and then you play 10 cost Ace when you get a little bit low on life, and you have a nice little rush unit there. I think Kid is actually a pretty strong leader, and historically, decks that are just generically good, especially in yellow or red, do well at the beginning of sets. So I could see Kid popping an event at the start of the OP10 meta, because maybe people are adjusting to decks, trying to figure out what's good, what's not, and because Yellow Kid specifically has a very straightforward game plan, a great curve if they see that curve. On 4 playing Hawkins, on 6 playing, I believe it's a Cavendish, Vanilla, and then on 8 playing the Kid, you're going to be in some trouble. So I'm going to put this at the top of competitive. I think that this has potential to do very well. I think it's a slightly better deck at the moment than Enel for yellow, and I could see this doing pretty strong over the course of a big tournament, especially at the beginning of a meta. I told you at the beginning of the video to strap in because it was going to be a long one, and boy, I did yap a lot, but here we have it. The leaders that I think are going to be the best to worst as far as OP10 goes. Overall, how do you think I did? Did I get most of the leaders right? Did I get your leader right? Hopefully I did. Hopefully I didn't rate it too lowly. Please, once again, if your leader ended up in a tier that you disagree with, let me know, but do it in a respectful manner. I am all for conversation, but please, my leader necessarily isn't in a tier that I want it to be in either, so I completely understand. But let's have some healthy conversation in the comments. Thank you so much, guys, for watching. I really appreciate you hanging out for the entirety of this video. I know it's a long one, and I yapped a lot, but I hope you guys appreciate this. Hopefully, you guys get some direction as well as far as what leaders to invest in and play for OP10. Super excited to start the OP10 meta. We'll be getting some of our deck highlight coverage here shortly. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.